time probably is. It was a dark and stormy night. It's from a 19th century English novel of no consequence. I doubt any of you have ever read it, even though you probably know the first line. And that first line isn't even unique to the author who wrote it as the first line, because he stole it from an American writer about 20 years earlier. But either way, here we are about 200 years later, in fact, over 200 years later, and it's still a very famous line, even if the reason for it is not. You know, it's really hard to begin a good story. And here we have a great story. We have before us the books of Samuel. Actually, what we have are the first two books of Kings. If we were Jewish, we're living back in about the time of the exile, we would look at 1 Samuel as really 1 Kings. That's what we would probably call it, something like that. And then 2 Samuel would be the second book of Kings. And then 1 Kings would be the third book of the Kings. And then 2 Kings in our Bible would be the fourth book of the Kings. There were actually four. These were really long books. And actually 1 and 2 Samuel was one really big book. But because it was so big, you can imagine how long a scroll would have to be. And to find something near the end of the scroll, you'd have to roll it all the way out. They divided into two scrolls, something that would make it a little bit easier to understand. So here's this great story. And how do you start a great story like this? How do you start telling the story of the beginning of the Jewish kingdom and of these great characters like Samuel and Saul and David, and then all of the minor characters that play such a significant role in the story? But with all these people, and as important as they are, and I'm sure that if we wanted, we could spend weeks studying the lives of these men like Saul and David. We have to realize that in every Old Testament narrative, in those stories, there is only one hero: God. God is the hero of the Old Testament stories. And the purpose of the story is not that it plays out some drama in front of you like some Greek play. It's not that it just reveals to you some fascinating, mind-bending, or expanding story that you can really just enjoy reading. It's so that you would get a better understanding of who God is and a better understanding of what His plans and goals are in the world and how He brings them to pass. And so what we have in these stories of 1 and 2 Samuel is a progression of Israel from conquering nation to an inevitable exile that's going to come hundreds of years in the future. In fact, frankly, the time of the judges was not particularly good. 1 Samuel comes on the heels of Ruth, and Ruth is really an appendix to the book of Judges. After Moses brought the children of Israel out of Egypt and the rebellious Jews died in the wilderness, the generation of Joshua, that great generation that came up into the promised land, that generation dies off. And then after that, there is a cycle of rebellion against God, judgment by God, repentance of that rebellion, and then the cycle starts over again. And with each time of repentance, God would send a judge. And the judges start off really good. You have judges like Othniel and Jephthah and even Gideon, who is, by the way, a pretty mixed character. It's kind of like Solomon. There are some good things and some bad things in Gideon. But you get to the end of the Judges, and it's pretty bad. The last of the judges in the book of Judges is Samson, and he's not really that great of a judge, even though he's mentioned by the writer of Hebrews later as being one of faith, whose faith we can follow as an example. He's a carnal man, wicked in many ways and immoral. And yet he judges Israel for 20 years. But when we open the book of 1 Samuel, we kind of come out of that time of the judges, we really hit the last judge. And it's not Samson. And it's not even Eli, though Eli is the judge mentioned here in the first chapter. It's Samuel. And what I want to do for the next few months is walk you through the life of this final judge. Actually, Samuel's a really neat character. Do you know that he pictures in an imperfect way Jesus Christ. In many ways, Samuel is a prophet, he is a priest, and he is also a king in the sense that he is judging Israel like a king would judge a nation. He pictures all of these offices. Samuel is this great leader. Even though the people are going to reject him, he is an incredible leader of Israel. And what we find here is Samuel judging Israel in a time of great spiritual wickedness. In fact, Samuel is like this brilliant diamond on a backdrop of blackness. I think it's really important to realize that at the time these books were written, and they come much later than Samuel's life. It isn't a person right after Samuel dies writing a biography. Or today you write your own biography before you even die and get it published. You're in your mid-40s. It's time to write your biography, or some biographer writes it of you, especially if you're running for high office. In this case, probably Ezra is the writer of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And if that's the case, we're talking hundreds of years later. Now, we know from the books of Samuel and Kings that there are written sources. You have the books of Asher and other places. You have these books that are mentioned. But we have these books codified, written down for us, probably around the time of Ezra, after the Jewish exile. And it makes me ask the question of why. Why would people living after the exile really need to study the life of Samuel and then later characters like Saul and David? Now, I think there is some relevance. And in fact, I think the relevance with the original audience is significant, and even for us today is pretty significant. Now, let me go back through some just fast ideas that will help you understand this book. They were probably published, as I said, in one volume to help post-exilic Jews see how far Israel fell away from God. That's the first thing they're going to notice. Here are people living in a time when they have every opportunity to follow after God, and yet they won't. And then God raises up David from a sheepfold to the kingdom and brings the kingdom together, all the tribes together. This story of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, you get to the end of that story and you find the land being purchased for the future temple that Solomon will build there in Zion. This story reminds the people how God raised up the kingdom from nothing, how he provided a temple for worship, something the exilic Jews, these post-exilic Jews, would really recognize and long to see for themselves because Babylon had destroyed their temple. And these stories are filled with modern-day problems. You want relevance? Think through some of the things you find here. Men abusing women, wives betrayed by husbands, children who go wild, corrupt religious leaders, conspiracy to murder, deceitful politicians, power struggles, the horrors of war. Does that sound pretty up to date and modern? These are the stories you find in these books. But it also teaches that God is to be trusted. Here's what you find in 1st and 2nd Samuel. That God saves, that he delivers, and that he protects. That he judges the wicked and vindicates the righteous. That he raises up the lowly and he humbles the proud. That he provides life to the barren. That he created the world for his glory. That he strengthens the weak and overpowers the strong. He brings life out of death and gives power to the Son, the King of Israel, who will be an image of his own Son, Jesus Christ. This story begins at the dawn of new hope in an age of despair. Israel is at a low point. The priesthood is corrupt. The people are superstitious and idolatrous, and they're under the assault of the Philistines. And into this story, God places a man. God gives a man to Israel, a godly man, a good man. And what we have in this story really are two very interesting ideas. Now remember, Samuel is not the hero of 1st and 2nd Samuel. God is the hero. And what we have here in this opening story are two levels of thought. You can't miss this. Follow this carefully. There is a devotional level. That's what you typically hear when you hear 1 Samuel chapter 1. This is the part that's very common and probably familiar to you. That is the devotional part that you have this grieving woman who wants a child and she prays and God gives her a child. And can you think of a better story to have on Mother's Day than this story? But there's also a theological level, and it should not be missed. Because what you're also saying is not only God's grace to Hannah, that devotional, that heartwarming story, but you also have God giving something to Israel that's really incredible. Do they deserve Samuel? They have judges like Eli and Samson to look back on. Do they deserve a Samuel? And the answer is no. They're in idolatry. They're in superstition. And God gives them this man because God is full of grace. And I want to look at these two ideas. I want to begin with the devotional level, and then I want to finish with that theological level. And I want you to see that. And the theological level is a little more difficult to understand, but I think it's important that you understand it. So we'll begin, number one. Samuel is a gift of God to a grieving woman. Now here's Hannah, and she's just full of grief because she's infertile. She can't have children. In fact, the problem is stated directly at the end of verse 2 that she had no children. She was barren, and because Elkanah had other children, it is supposed that this burden was on Hannah alone. But we know that the real reason for Hannah's infertility is that God was the one preventing her from having children. You see that at the end of verse 6. Now, in the ancient times, barrenness was a sign of God's judgment. According to Deuteronomy 28, fertility was part of God's covenant blessing on Israel. If they would follow Him and do as He commanded them to do, then He would bless them with having actually fruit. And the idea there of fruit in Deuteronomy 28 is of having children. So there's almost a sense from verse 18 later in Deuteronomy 28 that a curse on children would be a curse on childbearing. I don't think it's an actual curse on the child. So Hannah's fertility or infertility was really a sign not that Hannah was disobedient before the Lord, but that God's people were disobeying the covenant. But barrenness often resulted in accompanying problems. I think that Elkanah had a second wife because Hannah couldn't have children. If you've ever really thought through the story, Hannah is called the one, and the other is Peninnah. This is pretty common. Do you remember Abraham? He had a wife named Sarah who couldn't have children. He knew he was supposed to have children because of God's covenant promise to him, and so he went out and got a surrogate mom, a surrogate mother for a child named Hagar, and had a relationship with her so that he could have a son, Ishmael, through her. I believe that Peninnah is Elkanah's Hagar. He can't have children with his wife. He does not want to put her away. She is a wife that he loves, but he marries another woman. And women who were barren were considered cursed by God. And this brings her just inconsolable grief. Peninnah is her bitter rival. She's jealous of Hannah. Peninnah has sons and daughters, but Elkanah loves Hannah. Hannah is his true love, and Peninnah is angry. And so Peninnah causes Hannah pain. She causes distress. She provokes her. She stirs up strife so that Hannah is bitter in soul. You see this in verse 10 where it talks about her trembling before the Lord. She was in bitterness of spirit. She's weeping. That kind of shaking that happens when a person is just sobbing. That's what Hannah is doing. So much so, she's in so inconsolable grief, she cannot even eat food. Her husband says, you need to eat to keep up your strength. And she doesn't want to eat. She refuses to eat because she has so much grief. And so she pours out her grief in prayer. And this is what a godly woman does. She brings her burdens to the Lord. So Hannah rises up after they had eaten, the others had eaten in Shiloh, and after they had had something to drink. And Eli the priest is sitting by a post of the temple. And here comes Hannah in, and she makes a bargain with God. And I was thinking to myself, Hannah is probably going through, in some senses, the 5 stages of grief. And you could almost look at that here. This is stage 3, by the way, if you know anything about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who developed the 5 stages of grief. And these are not unreal. Observation over time has led to these very identifiable stages. You have denial, and you have anger, and then you have this bargaining, and then you have depression, and then you have acceptance. That's, I think, what Kubler-Ross wrote. I don't think Christians necessarily go through those stages as unbelievers do, especially those who are close to the Lord. But here's Hannah, and clearly she's bargaining. She vows this vow. She prays to God, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. And you realize something in the Old Testament economy, vows are very important. You don't make a vow and just decide not to keep it in the Old Testament. We don't deal a lot with vows in the New Testament, and a lot of us don't even make vows. We pray and we kind of give these general promises to the Lord, but we don't make vows like these. These are serious. You make a vow to the Lord, God's going to hold you to it. And this vow is really important. And she says, I will give up my son back to you. And she makes this vow of the Nazarite, which was, he will be yours completely. I will not bring a razor to his head. This reference to the Nazarite vow from Numbers chapter 6. These very special servants of God who abstained from anything from the vine, grapes or juice or wine, who had unshorn hair and they would avoid dead bodies. They were always ceremonially clean. And this is Hannah's vow. And it brings me to a couple of applications for you. That here's Hannah, and she's grieving. And I don't think she's grieving necessarily as an unbeliever grieves, because she has some hope that God will answer her prayer. And I think for us, we can look at the story and realize two things. That infertility today is not a sign of judgment. I think we know that. In our culture, God doesn't say, here's my covenant with Israel and here's my covenant with the pagan cultures like the one we live in. I don't think there's a one-for-one correlation there. But I do think we can say that God still answers prayer. And I think we can say that very strongly, that if you are in a position where you have burdens, you should bring them before the Lord. What does Paul write? Cast your cares. Don't be anxious for anything, but with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. Whereas Peter says, casting all your cares upon him because he cares for you. And so whether your problem is in your personal life, whether it's your health or your finances, whether it's your career, it could be something in your family with children or with parents or with grandparents. It could be an issue that you're having in the marketplace, whether it's in society or in your neighborhoods. Whatever the burden you have, you can bring it to God and cast your care before him because he still answers prayer. Samuel is a gift to a grieving woman and evidence of God's grace to her. But, number 2, while Samuel's story is of God's grace to Hannah, it's also a story of God's grace to a sinful nation. Just like Hannah did not necessarily deserve God's blessing, God blessed her because he's gracious, so Israel was undeserving of God's blessing. Israel's living in gross sin. The house of Eli is wicked. Look at verse 3. Excuse me. This man went up out of the city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the 2 sons of Eli, the priests of the Lord. Here are the priests, Hophni and Phinehas. Eli is the head priest, the worship center of Israel. This is the place of worship for the people. And you'll realize later that place will be transferred from Shiloh to Jerusalem and the temple will be built there. But here is the place of worship, the tabernacle. And here is the spiritual leader of Israel. And he's not a very good guy. He's not a very godly man. He's a judge. In fact, in chapter 4 and verse 18, we find him sitting at the gate. He's waiting for news of the battle. This is considered the place of rule in ancient Israel. It's like sitting on a throne. But he has failed sons. And the failure is his. We find that in chapter 2 and verse 23. That God says, your sons are as they are because of you. And how were they? Chapter 3 verse 13 says they were vile men. They were sons of Belial. And isn't it striking you, if you go over to chapter 2 and look at verse 12, saying that they are sons of Belial. Isn't it striking that this is the very charge that Eli makes of Hannah? He could say to this woman, don't be a daughter of Belial, but he turns around and has his own sons be sons of Belial. He can't challenge them. Belial means worthless. It's a combination of not And the word value is of no value. It's a personification of pride and lawlessness, attributes that are given to Satan. And by the way, as the Hebrew language develops over time, the word Belial becomes synonymous with the name Satan. He is Belial. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, what accord does Christ have with Belial? This is the name for Satan. And the sin of these young men is great before the Lord. How did they sin? They sinned, chapter 2 and verse 15, by forcing the people to sacrifice improperly. They would bring their sacrifice, and the way it worked is you would take your animal, and after it was sacrificed and it was cut, it was placed into a pot, it would be boiled, and then they would take a hook down into the pot, and whatever came out was the priests, and then the family would eat the rest. But if you do it that way, you're leaving it up to, in Hophni and Phinehas' mind, you're leaving it up to chance as to what cut of meat you're going to get. They want a nice cut of meat. They want to eat the best cuts. They don't want something like the tongue or brains or something like that to come out. Whatever parts of the animal they're going to eat, they want to be able to pick which part of the steak they can have. So they would pick beforehand. You would bring your offering, it would be sacrificed, and then before you put it in the pot, we're going to have this piece and we're going to have this piece. And they would choose, so much so that the people actually said, we don't want to bring sacrifices to God because of what Hophni and Phinehas were doing. They were pushing down the people's desire to worship God. And by the way, we find out later of Eli that he has a problem with his balance, a loss of eyesight, and he was really fat. And it leads me to think that all of this choosing cuts of meat led to probably diabetes. That's probably what he has. And being diabetic myself, I have some sympathy for Eli, but I understand what this is talking about. Those are all the symptoms of diabetes. This man ate himself to death. But it's worse than just food. You look at chapter 2 and verse 22, you find that these men were committing sexual sin with women who came to the tabernacle to worship. It says they lay with the women that assembled at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Here's the place of worship of God, and the most immoral behavior is taking place. Can you imagine how God is thinking about this? Can you imagine how God is responding to this? Do the people deserve Samuel? Really, in your mind, you need to think this through, because what happens next is really almost unexplainable, except that it's God, because if it were human beings, we would just be saying, done with you. But God says, let me give you Samuel. And you have in verse 1, the way the writer puts it. This is really important that you follow this. The way the writer puts it, there was a man of Ramathaim Zophim, of Mount Ephraim, named Elkanah. And then it gives his lineage. Son of Jehoram, of Elihu, of Tohu, of Zaph, an Ephrathite, who had 2 wives. The way he's writing, he's giving you a sense of this is something really special going on. This is a promise of God. We're going to find the promise later in chapter 2 and verse 35 that Eli will be judged. Eli is going to be put down. His house is going to be actually cut off. The sin of his family will cross generations. Eli's grandchildren, chapter 2 and verse 36, says they will beg for food. Their sons would die in verse 34 in one day, and the ruin would be the family would never overcome its struggle. All the young men would die early. But Samuel would be a faithful priest. Look at chapter 2 and verse 35. It says, and I will raise me up a faithful priest. That's Samuel. And this is what's really remarkable about this, because here's a nation that has no reason to think that God will somehow rescue them, that they have no reason to think that God will save them, and God gives them Samuel as a blessing. He says, here is the man who will judge you. He raises up before himself a faithful priest. And now we have something really remarkable going on. The writer, probably Ezra, writing to a post-exilic world, people after the exile. They had already sinned. The Assyrians had conquered in the 700s BC. The Babylonians had conquered in the 500s BC. They had been in exile for 70 years. There are waves of people coming back to Jerusalem. Ezra is in one of those waves. And he is a priest before God. And he's writing of this priest, this faithful man. And now he is doing something really important. Because he's comparing Samuel to Old Testament figures who predate him. In fact, it's really neat. The way that we read verses 1 and 2 is the same way you read the story of Samson. Go back to Judges. It's just a few chapters back. Go back to Judges chapter 13. This is the story of Samson. We read the Bible and we just kind of think everybody wrote everything, one author. We just kind of lose track of these really important things. Here you have probably Samuel writing Judges. And Samuel writes, there was a certain man of Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and bare not. Do you see that expression? The next time you find that kind of sentence construction is in 1 Samuel chapter 1. The next time, if you're reading this in Hebrew and you're reading along, and you've read the Old Testament stories, and now 70 or so years have gone by, and now you're reading what Ezra has written to this generation of people who lived hundreds of years after Samuel, and you're reading now the same sentence construction. Well, it's like the old game Concentration, where they would lift up a card and you'd see a figure, and then later lift up another card. And you go, oh, those are the same. This is kind of what's happening here. You have one sentence written in Judges, and you have another sentence written in Samuel, and they're very, very similar. And what happens when writers do that in the Old Testament is they're trying to draw your attention to something significant. They're making a comparison. And the comparison is that Samuel is going to rise up like Samson. Not the same kind of man. He will be a faithful priest, but he rises up like Samson. He is a special gift of God to the people. And you have that. There was a certain man who was of a hometown, who was a certain tribe, and here was his marital status. And then, of course, both of them are Nazarites. There's clear connection between Samuel and Samson. There's a second connection given. Not only is it compared to Samson, he's compared to Isaac. Samuel is the son of a woman who's unable to have children until God specifically caused her to do so. When you think of barrenness, it's not really very common. And when you go into the Old Testament, particularly in Israel, it's very uncommon. You don't read about it a lot. I'm sure there were other barren women other than these. But you read stories like Abraham and Sarah. And then you have stories like Isaac and Rebekah. You have Jacob and Rachel had trouble conceiving and then finally had Joseph. And then you have later stories in the Old Testament, and you come to people who are really having difficulty having children. And these are really important stories. And when you get to this one, this story of Hannah, you find a comparison to Isaac, because Isaac is the child of promise. And a promise is made by Eli the judge that you will have a son. And that's the same kind of promise that God makes to Abraham. You will have a son. And so the writer of Samuel is saying, I want to draw your attention. He's going to be a man like Samson, a judge of Israel, but he's also going to be a man like Isaac, a son of promise. And then third, he's compared to Moses. He's related to Moses through birth. Did you know that Samuel is a Kohathite? Now you think, who are the Kohathites? If you go back through Moses' lineage, you kind of go back before Moses, you find that he was an offspring of a man named Kohath. Actually, Korah, who rises up against Moses there in Numbers, Korah is also a Kohathite. Korah is actually Moses' cousin. He tries to take over Israel. He ends up being swallowed up by the ground. Do you remember that kind of cool story? That was one of the ones I really loved when I was a kid. The ground swallows up Korah. Well, you have this story here, and you have Moses. He's a descendant of Kohath, and Samuel is also a descendant of Kohath. And you have the whole sense of the trauma of his parents regarding his birth. You have this trauma in the story of Hannah and Elkanah and Peninnah and the grief and the sobbing. And do you remember for Moses' birth, there was the whole problem with the king of Egypt and Pharaoh and how he wanted to destroy the Israelites. And then you have the purpose of God from his birth to lead Israel in a difficult transition from one to another. Here you have Moses bringing the children of Israel out of Egypt. Here you have Samuel bringing the children of Israel from a transition from the judges into the period of the kings. Now, what does all that mean? You're sitting there going, Pastor, theology puts me to sleep. You wore me out. What does this mean? It's really important. Samuel is not your average, ordinary guy. It's not like God says, I'm going to give you a Matt. He's a pretty good guy. Snappy dresser. That's what I'm going to give you. That's not what he's saying. I'm going to give you a very special gift. And does Israel deserve this gift? No. They're wicked. They're ungodly. Their priests are corrupt. They're committing gross sin. They're not worshiping God as they should. God has every right just to destroy Israel. But God is a faithful God. And what that tells me is that even though I am often not as I should be, even though I am often sinful and sometimes very sinful, God is still a God of grace. And I can hang on to that truth that even Israel, who had no right and no desert to think that they would somehow be able to have a priest like Samuel, get Samuel. Anyway, because God is gracious. And my friends, that's really the story of chapter 1. God is still gracious today. To Hannah, he is gracious in that he gives her a son. But to Israel, he is gracious because he gives them a priest they do not deserve. And I think for all of us, we can walk away from this story saying, for me, even though I don't deserve God's grace, God gives it to me. Sometimes I think about, because my children are in their early adulthood life, I think about what I was like in my early adulthood life. I think about sometimes things that I said to people, things that I did, and it just makes me shudder. It gets me upset when I think about it, so I try to put it out of my mind. Do you ever go through that kind of experience? It makes me wonder how anybody gets up to age 25. My dad used to say to me when I was especially incorrigible, he would say something like, son, I brought you into this world, and I can take you out. Now, I didn't really believe he would harm me, but he said that out of his frustration. And I look back on my life and I can see evidence of time after time where God just gave me grace when I didn't deserve it. And I think the story of Samuel, the life of Samuel, is God saying to Hannah, but then really to all of Israel, here's grace. You don't deserve it, but here it is. And you look at the New Testament and you walk into these New Testament stories about grace and you realize how incredible God's grace is. He saved me. I didn't deserve it. He's rescued me from myself over and over again. I didn't deserve it. He's given me an opportunity to serve him in a capacity that I just had no concept of when I was a teenager or even a young adult. I didn't deserve it. And he's given me a family that I didn't deserve. He's blessed me in thousands of ways for which often I am unthankful. But it's just God's grace and I didn't deserve it. And yet he's blessed me. And he's blessed you. This is the story of Samuel. God's grace. And he's still gracious today. Let's pray. Father, help us to realize